See, the other differences between Indian Constitution and American Constitution is Indian Constitution provides for parliamentary democracy. American Constitution provides for presidential democracy. See, Indian Constitution provides for parliamentary democracy, and remember, in parliamentary democracy there is a fusion of executive and legislative branches. So executive branch is drawn from the legislative branch, and the executive branch is made accountable to the legislative branch. So parliamentary democracy compared to presidential democracy is much more accountable form of democracy. But for the executive branch to continue in office, it has to maintain absolute majority in the lower house continuously. If the executive branches of the government loses majority in the lower house, it has to resign. So the problem with parliamentary democracy is political instability. There is a danger that the parliamentary democracies, especially with multi-party democracies, they have the danger of political instability. So political instability is the demerit, and political instability is the demerit, and accountability is the merit. Parliamentary democracy more accountable but possibly less stable. Presidential democracy, there is separation of executive and legislative branches, and the executive branch will have a fixed tenure. So though it is not so accountable like parliamentary democracy, but it is definitely stable. Presidential democracy, merit is stability, political stability. Demerit, when compared to parliamentary democracy, it is relatively less accountable. It is relatively less accountable form of democracy. Then Prime Minister and Council of Ministers. In a parliamentary democracy, the Prime Minister and Council of Ministers, they shall be members of Parliament. In a presidential democracy, the American President and the cabinet colleagues of the American President, they shall not be members of the American Parliament. They shall not be members of the American Parliament. In addition to this, in India, the executive branch of the government can be removed by passing a no confidence motion. There is no such motion in the American Parliament. The American President is elected for a fixed tenure of 4 years. Within 4 years, except for the violation of American Constitution, he cannot be removed by passing a no confidence motion. There is no such no confidence motion in the American Parliament. So the removal of the executive branch cannot be done except for the violation of the American Constitution. In addition to this, in the Indian Constitution, there is question hour and zero hour. So in the question hour and the zero hour, the members of the Parliament can ask questions to the Prime Minister and the ministers and can make the government accountable. There are no such parliamentary devices in the American Parliament. So question hour and zero hour are absent in the American Parliament. So through question hour and zero hour, the Parliament can make the executive branch accountable. So this is one more reason why we say parliamentary democracy is much more accountable compared to the presidential democracy. Then, in India, which had a parliamentary democracy, the executive power is conferred on the entire cabinet headed by Prime Minister. So the political power is not with one individual, it is given to the entire cabinet headed by the Prime Minister. So there is collective sharing of the political power. So what is the merit if the executive power is conferred on a group of individuals? The diversity could be better accommodated. The ministers from different regions speaking different languages, belonging to different religions, and belonging to different castes can be better accommodated because the executive power is conferred on a group of individuals called the cabinet. So power sharing among the diverse groups is made possible. But in America, the entire executive power is conferred on one individual, that is the American President. And there are cabinet colleagues to advise the American President. Their advice is not binding on the American President. So the entire power is conferred on one individual, that is the American President. And in addition to this, in parliamentary democracy, the decisions have to be taken collectively. And on all major policies, all the major policies have to be collectively decided by the entire cabinet headed by Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister cannot take individual decision. All shall agree. So that's why the principle of collective responsibility. Even if one minister disagrees with the cabinet, he has to resign. So the principle of swim or sink together. So we have the principle of collective responsibility in parliamentary democracy. There is no such principle in presidential democracy in America. In addition to this, I told you that the parliamentary democracy is much more accountable because the executive is drawn from the legislature and the executive is accountable to the legislature. There is no such kind of accountability in the presidential democracy in America. The president is elected for a fixed tenure. He cannot be removed within 4 years except for the violation of American Constitution. And in India, the head of the Indian nation state is president, but the head of the government is prime minister. And the president is the nominal executive. Prime minister heading the cabinet is the real executive. So the entire administration of the union government is carried on in the name of the president, but the real powers are exercised by the cabinet headed by prime minister. So president is the nominal executive, prime minister and the cabinet is the real executive. But in America, the American president is not only the head of the American nation state, he is also the head of the government. And if you compare the two houses in India in the Indian parliament and the two houses in the American parliament, in India, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, they enjoy almost equal powers. The upper house is not a very weak chamber, except in few instances like money bill, confidence and no confidence motion. With respect to withdrawal of national emergency, though Lok Sabha enjoys special powers, but otherwise, in a vast majority of other situations, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, they enjoy almost equal powers. So if you carefully look into the powers of the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, the position is that in India, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, they had almost equal powers. But that is not the case in America. So in America, remember American Parliament is also bicameral. The upper house is called American Senate. The lower house is called House of Representatives. Remember, American Senate, which is the upper house in the American Parliament, is the most powerful upper house in the world. And House of Representatives, which is the lower house in the American Parliament, is the weakest lower house in the world. So you can see the difference between upper house and lower house. Upper house very powerful, lower house very weak. So unlike in India, in America, both upper house and lower house, they don't enjoy almost equal powers. The upper house is very powerful, the lower house is weak. Then in India, in Rajya Sabha, which is the upper house, there are nominated members nominated by the president on the advice of the union government. Out of total 245 members in the Rajya Sabha, 12 are nominated members. But in the American Parliament, in the upper house, which is the American Senate, there are no nominated members. All the members are elected. In addition to this, in the Rajya Sabha, which is the upper house, members other than the nominated members are indirectly elected by the members of the state legislative assemblies. But in America, the members of the American Senate, they are directly elected by the people. That's one more difference. In addition to this, in upper house, in America, all the states are equally represented, irrespective of the size of the population, irrespective of the geographical size of a particular state. All the states have equal representation in the upper house, which is the American Senate in America. But in India, the states are not equally represented. Bigger states like UP, Uttar Pradesh have greater representation in the Rajya Sabha. Recently, in 2009-10 report, Madan Mohan Punchi Commission has recommended that all the states in India must have equal representation in the upper house, that is in Rajya Sabha. So that was a recommendation which is not yet implemented. This is one more difference between Indian Constitution and American Constitution. Then, in America, all the international agreements signed by the American president and all the important appointments made by the American president must get the approval of the Senate, that is the upper house. Otherwise, such agreements and such appointments are not valid. For example, the First World War came to an end with the Treaty of Versailles, and the American president, the then American president Woodrow Wilson, has signed this Treaty of Versailles, but this Treaty of Versailles was rejected by the American Senate. So America could not become the member of League of Nations, which is created through the Treaty of Versailles. So in America, all the international agreements signed by the American president, all the important appointments made by the American president, for example, the judges of the American Supreme Court, they are appointed by the American president, and the members of the independent regulatory authorities, they are appointed by the American president. All the ambassadors were appointed by the American president. So such appointments will come into implementation provided the upper house, that is American Senate, gives its stamp of approval. There is no such power to the Rajya Sabha, which is the upper house in India. Then, if there is corruption in the executive departments under the American president, the American Senate, which is the upper house, can appoint investigating committees on the charges of corruption in the departments working under the American president. There is no such power to the Indian Rajya Sabha, which is the upper house. So in this sense, Senate differs from Rajya Sabha, and Senate, the reason why the Senate is very powerful and why the Senate is the most powerful upper house in the world is it has the power to give the stamp of approval for all the international agreements signed by the American president. It has the power to give the stamp of approval for all the important appointments made by the American president. In addition to this, in the American Senate, all the states are equally represented. All the states are equally represented. Then, in India, which is a parliamentary democracy, the House is more powerful than the committees. Even in Indian Parliament, there are parliamentary committees. So parliamentary committees will assist the houses by sharing the burden of the work. But the final decisions are taken by the House as a whole. So in India or in Britain, which have parliamentary democracies, when you compare the houses, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, with the parliamentary committees, the houses are more powerful than the committees. But in America, the committees are much more powerful than the houses. All the decisions are taken in the committees. It will not be further discussed in the house. So the committees are much more powerful than houses. The entire decision making in the American Parliament is done in the committees. The matter will not be again discussed in the house. And in American Parliament, as the American President is not the member of American Parliament, as the cabinet colleagues of the American President are not members of the American Parliament, so the American President and his cabinet colleagues cannot introduce bills in the American Parliament. So all the bills in the American Parliament, they are private member bills. What do you mean by private member bill? A private member bill is one which is introduced by a member of parliament who is not a minister. So in America, the ministers are not members of the parliament. So there is no question of the minister introducing a bill in the parliament. So as all the bills in the American parliament are introduced by members of the parliament, American parliament who are not ministers, they are called private member bills. In the American parliament, all the bills which are introduced are private member bills. Why? Because the ministers are not members of the parliament and the ministers cannot introduce the bills. So a bill which is introduced by any member of the American Parliament who is not a minister is a private member bill. In the American Parliament, all the bills which are introduced in the American Parliament, they are private member bills. But in India, the Prime Minister and the ministers, they are members of the Indian Parliament. Most of the bills are introduced by the ministers. So most of the bills are government bills. Most of the bills introduced in the Indian Parliament are government bills. Only a few bills are private member bills. So as I have already told you, a private member bill is a bill which is introduced by a member of Indian Parliament who is not a minister. So in the Indian Parliament, most of the bills are government bills and only a few are private member bills. Private member bills.